All right, I'm going to start. Okay. I begin this presentation with the following question. Who are Tibetans? How have they been framed as objects for study across time? For earlier Western academics and the audiences who read their work, Tibetans were a people largely defined by religious beliefs and institutions. In this presentation, I argue that this emphasis in early Tibetan studies set a precedent for sidelining Tibetan sovereignty as a central concern in both scholarship and in real-world politics, a trend which continues to impact the field in Tibetan lives today. While researchers are interested in understanding the structural authority and functions of the sovereign, their orientalizing readings often sidelined analysis of Tibet's geopolitical history and developments in Central Asia as an empire and nation. This deep prioritizing necessarily ignores the rich body of indigenous history transmitted through literary production and oral traditions produced by Tibetans for Tibetan audiences that dates back centuries. A chronological examination of scholarly productions on Tibet undertaken predominantly by Western scholars reveal the making of Tibetan studies as a Western academic subject based on ideas and interpretations of Tibetans by Westerners. Similarly, modern Chinese scholarship on Tibet has been heavily influenced by Orientalist Western traditions. Both demonstrate the importance of acknowledging histories of representation. In the 17th century, missionaries and imperialists from the West reached Tibet. Their arrival and interests were deeply entangled with imperial competitions in this period. Although Tibet had not fallen under the purview of British colonialism directly, by the 18th century, its neighbor India was an integral part of the British Empire, and successive Tibetan polities had to negotiate with this global power. While Russia and Qing China had been old neighbors of Tibet, the entrance of Britain caused new geopolitical insecurities and competitions fueled by trade and security interests. To secure British interests in the region, official overtures were made to Tibet by diplomatic missions. Unofficially, in the Himalayan borderlands, the British trained spies to undertake covert mapping operations. These interests were central to the appearance of state-supported and popular publishing related to Tibet. British interests in Tibet were nurtured first in the Indian Himalayas, a region of India that had a long history of diplomatic and economic engagement with Tibet. Missionary endeavors were originally sparked by the interest of religious conversion. In 1624, the Jesuits established Tibet's first Western mission in Separang in Western Tibet. Such activities were sponsored by and intersected with imperial competitions between Britain, Russia, and the Qing. Missionary activities in Tibet would go on to inspire colonial diplomatic expeditions that sometimes materialized in illegal map-making missions for the competing empires. Many of these figures would become famed Tibetologists in their respective countries in the West and contributed to the making of the study of Tibet. Since the primary concern of missionaries in Tibet was religious conversion, their observations tended to focus primarily on Tibetan religious life. Initially, missionaries observed Tibetan society through the framework of its religious figures and incarnate tokus, institutions, and rituals narrowly as an avenue for engaging their conversion agendas. Missionaries such as Antonio Giorgi and Ippolito Desideri studied the Tibetan language and culture as a way for carrying out religious conversion activities. Although Desideri was a sympathetic observer, he never fully realized that the Lamaism he was studying was a form of Buddhism. Gradually, missionary accounts became more advanced through an engagement with Tibetan religious and historical texts. August Hermann Frack and K. Marx, for instance, worked on the Ladakh Chronicles, a translated history of Ladakh compiled by and about the Namgyal dynasty, which was the first Tibetan dynasty in Ladakh. In addition to cataloging working knowledge of the region, missionary work on Tibetan history and religion was to be used for engaging Tibetan cultural context as a method for propagating Christianity. Alongside carrying out their own agendas, missionary expeditions were made possible through sponsorship from competing imperial interests. The Qing, for instance, employed missionaries to make maps of Tibet that were later used by British diplomats, who also engaged in their own illegal map-making projects in Tibet. As such, missionary projects in Tibet were integral to the establishment in imperial interests that followed. Alongside missionary expeditions, diplomatic missions to Tibet that were intended to establish trade relations also became popular. These encounters inspired travel and observational accounts of Tibetan society by colonial diplomats and undercover spies disguised as travelers who engaged in covert map-making activities not approved by the Tibetan government. George Bogle and Samuel Turner were among the first Westerners to travel to Tibet on British missions during the early 19th century and opened the diplomatic chapter in the Western encounter with Tibet. Bogle entered Tibet to establish trade relations using a map by the missionary D'Anville that was originally commissioned by the Qing Emperor Qiangxi. Bogle's diary and travel notes focused on his interaction with the 6th Panchen Lama and Tashin Lompo Monastery, and portrayed Tibetans as honest and simple people with no wants but those of nature, while presenting Tibetan society as a harmless theocracy that was relatively enlightened. His portrayals of Tibet would later influence the making of James Hilton's novel, Lost Horizon, and shape notions of Tibet as Shangri-La in the West. Later, the British trained a number of Indians and ethnic Tibetans to carry out exploration expeditions in Tibet as part of the international struggle with Russia during the Great Games. In 1865, Nain Singh Rawat, a British spy, crossed the border disguised as a religious pilgrim to begin illegally mapping Tibet. Following this journey, the British sent Sarat Chandra Das, a British-trained surveyor, to Tibet in 1879. Chandra Das would return to Tibet again in 1884 as a British spy to collect information on Tibetan, Russian, and Chinese activities. Das spent the rest of his career as a Tibetologist in Darjeeling and published on a large collection of Tibetan religious texts he obtained in Tibet. While such approved and unapproved expeditions to Tibet were in the service of competing imperial interests, those leading the expeditions went on to become the foundational Tibetologists of their time and shaped the making of Tibetan studies as a study in the West. Much of this work served as introductory material to the Tibetan geography and elite religious worlds more broadly for a Western audience. However, much of this work was ahistorical in the case of travel and observational accounts that failed to understand Tibetan people and their societies as historically dynamic. Although the focus on elite religious worlds allowed for some translated historical accounts of specific figures, scholars failed to consider how such accounts shaped the development of Tibet as a society. In terms of achieving their agendas, missionaries had little success in converting Tibetans to Christianity. Their work was nonetheless made possible through imperial funding and hence were working in their service. This not only challenged Tibet's sovereignty, but also limited the scope of such research to their select interests. While this body of literature continues to be relevant and insightful in Tibetan studies, their developments cannot be divorced from the competing imperial agendas that accompanied such interests. As such, the scope of such scholarship were also limited in its perspective. In the late 19th and early 20th century, scholarship on Tibet produced by missionaries, diplomats, and spies was mined by British authorities to help them secure a foothold in the Tibetan market. Increased British commercial interest in Tibet led them to occupy parts of the Himalayan footholds. Such developments at the border did not go unnoticed by the Tibetan administration in Lhasa. In response, Tibetans banned the British from crossing the border. The British responded by continuing to construct roads alongside existing Himalayan trade routes towards Tibet in Sikkim. In 1886, responding to increasing encroachment of Tibet's border, the Tibetan government dispatched troops to begin constructing defensive walls along the border. 6 months later, the British responded by launching the first military invasion of Tibet. Following Tibetan defeat, Sikkim was officially annexed by the British and led to treaty negotiations regarding the boundary between Tibet and Sikkim. In 1904, due to growing suspicion that Tibet was becoming closer to Russia and Tibetan refusal to allow British access to Tibet, the British invaded. Colonel Francis' young husband was dispatched on a military expedition to enforce Lhasa officials into signing their treaty. The treaty forced the Lhasa administration to allow British commercial interests inside Tibet. 8 books by senior members of that expedition, including one by young husband himself, were published following their mission. The book details their military expedition, journey, and observations of Lhasa. Such accounts of travel stress the difficulty of the journey and the uniqueness of their experience. When they wrote about the context of these exploits, it was to stress the otherness and exoticness of the culture of Tibet, a place which they often characterized as sacred and mystical. Much of this genre of writing framed Tibet in terms of its potential for adventure, mysticism, exploration, and personal experiences. Despite shallow observations of the travel account, there were few noteworthy works by Sir Charles Alfred Bell and Augustine Waddell, who detailed the complex taxonomies of Tibetan life. Both authors arrived in Tibet as British officers, serving the interest of the British Empire. Augustine Waddell was the medical officer on the young husband mission to Lhasa. During his stay in Darjeeling, he purchased a Buddhist temple and studied its contents in the manner of cataloging and publishing his findings. In contrast to Bogle, who thought Tibetans were noble, Waddell condemned Tibetans as savages whose superstition and backwardness necessitated a violent and colonial kind of intervention. Compared to Waddell, Sir Charles Bell was more sympathetic. He was stationed in Lhasa for almost 20 years. Bell's personal friendship with the 13th Dalai Lama led him to write a biography of the Dalai Lama, and this relationship also contributed to favorable diplomatic outcomes for the British in Tibet. His personal relation with the 13th also helped Bell form other relations with religious and political elites of Lhasa, and would contribute to Bell's detailed and favorable perspectives of Tibetan history, people, and religion. His books provided insightful taxonomies of different economic classes, marriage practices, the position of women, foods, and so on. Bell's work became influential for developing scholarship on Tibet in the West. Waddell became a university professor in Britain and specialized on Tibet. Although works by Bell and Waddell proved valuable detail that enhanced the previously shallow observations of Tibetan social worlds, their scholarly work alongside the travel accounts became prevalent because of the imperial nature of their work. Sir Charles Bell and later Hugh Richardson, for instance, were responsible for the political versus ethnographic model of Tibet that anthropologist Carol McGranahan argues to be one of the things that made it possible for scholars to ignore Tibetan sovereignty. In 1910, the Qing launched a military invasion of Lhasa to establish direct rule in response to the British invasion of 1904. However, this invasion was short-lived due to the outbreak of the Chinese Nationalist Revolution of 1911. In response to both the British and Qing invasions, the 13th Dalai Lama proclaimed Tibetan independence in 1913. Such military developments demonstrated the actual nature of imperial aggressions against the Tibetan state and show how the very people leading such military expeditions became the expert figure who produced and developed Tibetan studies as a disciplinary study in their respective countries, leaving lasting legacies of empire. In 1949, the People's Republic of China invaded Tibet. Following a brief attempt to work with the PRC, deteriorating relations and circumstances forced the 14th Dalai Lama to flee to India in 1959. Only 12 years had passed since India had become a newly independent state, following a successful nationalist anti-colonial movement against the British. Around the same time, the United States had emerged victorious following the Second World War, and Cold War rivalry between the US and Russia had just begun. It was during this time that Tibetan studies became formalized in the US. Scholarship during this era began with journalistic coverage of the Chinese invasion of Tibet, was supported by the Cold War anti-communist interests, and led to the development of anthropological attempts to salvage traditional Tibetan worlds through the study of Tibetan refugees. Eventually, scholarship during this period culminated with the making of Himalayan studies following the rise of new national boundaries and the firm closing of Tibetan borders by the new Chinese government. Coverage of China's invasion of Tibet in the UK and US became enmeshed in journalistic accounts that focused more on the politics of Cold War rivalry than the nature of Tibet's invasion. In popular journalistic coverage from the 1950s, the invasion was represented in two ways. Pro-communist accounts framed Tibetans as simple peasants who were being freed from their feudal lords through the actions of the PRC. Anti-communist accounts, on the other hand, covered the invasion as a brutal communist dictatorship, bringing Tibet's freedom to its end. Anti-communist coverage of the invasion and exodus of Tibetan refugees succeeded in detailing the actual nature of military invasion. But the style of such narratives sought to frame the PRC as barbaric, primarily because they were communist rather than imperial. Both pro and anti-PRC accounts barely engaged the political nature of the invasion and what it meant for Tibet at large. This type of journalistic coverage waned when the problem of invasion was not resolved, and the flow of Tibetan refugees fleeing Tibet began decreasing due to border clampdowns by the 1970s. Despite such polarizing coverage, the Cold War politics played a role in developing Tibetan studies as a formal study in the United States. The Rockefeller Foundation made funding available for universities to begin teaching courses in Tibetan studies officially. The formalization of Tibetan studies in the US was, however, motivated by the imperial competitions played out through the Cold War rivalry, as the Rockefeller Foundation was actually run by the CIA. Much of this scholarship in social science generated during this era by scholars based in Europe and the US was influenced by the idea that the military invasion of Tibet by the PRC and devastation in Tibetan refugee camps in exile would bring an end to traditional Tibetan ways of life. This scholarship was more sophisticated than the prior era because the exodus of Tibetan refugees in Nepal and India made the perspectives of Tibetans from different walks of life available for foreign researchers at an unprecedented level. This work was motivated by a sense of urgency, a perceived need to preserve Tibetan traditional ways of life before such knowledges, practices, histories, and institutions were assumed to ultimately succumb to the devastation of colonization and exile. This research was conducted in the tradition of salvage anthropology. The project of preserving classic kinship structures of Tibetan society or recording social organization of nomads in the refugee camps in Nepal and India became important projects for preserving the authenticity of Tibetan cultural knowledge before it was assumed to be non-existent. As a result, salvage anthropologists recorded Tibetan social structures and organizations through the framework of religious institutions, kinship through polyandry, and nomadic ways of life. Alongside salvage activities by foreign scholars, the Tibetan leadership under the guidance of the 14th Dalai Lama also initiated their own agendas for preserving Tibetan cultural knowledges and histories in exile. However, the desires and agendas of Western scholars differed from the Tibetan leadership in exile. Foreign researchers tended to focus more on reconstructing traditional Tibetan worlds because such worlds were assumed to end due to colonization and acculturation. In contrast, the Tibetan leadership also engaged in similar activities of recording traditional knowledges. However, exiled Tibetans employed such activities as avenues for initiating reconstruction and continuation in exile. Although foreign research activities with Tibetans were viewed favorably by Tibetans, it is important to highlight how such activities stemmed from different motivations. Although Tibetans initially served as informants for such salvage research activities, by the 1980s, Tibetan scholars whose studies abroad had been facilitated by the Tibetan leadership in exile began contributing to the field as social scientists. This allowed scholarly work on Tibetan social and political worlds to become more sophisticated. Tibetan anthropologists such as Samdeng Karme wrote about Tibetan recollections of indigenous figures of Tibet's imperial and nationalist past through the framework of myths, rituals, and beliefs, and how such renderings structured the daily lives of its subjects. Ugyen Gombo wrote on Tibetan refugees experiencing sociocultural change and their attempts at adaptation and continuation in Nepal. On the one hand, such activities intersected with Tibetan refugees' attempts to counter PRC representations of earlier Tibetan society as barbaric and feudal, which necessitated their violent reform. On the other, Tibetans were also concerned with communicating the circumstances of the PRC's unlawful invasion of Tibet in the international arena. Such concerns prompted Tibetans to publish a number of books that included the Tibetan scholar and former finance minister of the Lhasa government, Tseben Wangchok Deden Shakaba's Political History of Tibet, and a series of autobiographies in English that aimed to convey the nature of Chinese imperialism, invasion, and rule to a Western audience to encourage political advocacy and intervention. Tibetan students in exile began entering international relations and political science programs at universities as an avenue for addressing the Chinese invasion and the effects of China's policies on Tibetans. While we are now aware of the devastation that the Cultural Revolution policies brought to Tibet, at the time, little information about the extent of the destruction was available to the outside world. As China boasted about its advancements in Tibet, Tibetan political scientists based in exile, such as Dawa Nobu, challenged such accounts by writing about the imperial nature of Chinese rule and the failure of China's Tibet policy in empowering Tibetans. Such initiatives by Tibetan scholars in addressing Tibet's political question was taken up by other scholars in the 1980s and 1990s. Noteworthy were the works of political scientists Warren Smith and historian Elliot Sperling. Yet, works by Native scholars, which continues to remain insightful and is largely unengaged in Tibetan studies, such reluctance to engage Native scholarship also brings up the question of whether Tibetan studies was able to treat its Native counterparts objectively as producers of scholarship worthy of engagement, rather than treat them subjectively as informants productive of data alone. Tibetan concerns about sovereignty were informed by continuing geopolitical developments in the Himalayan region. As China began drawing clear boundaries as a new Himalayan adjacent political authority, Chinese military activities at the border caused for war to break out with India in 1962. Such developments forced India and the Himalayan nations of Nepal and Bhutan to respond with their own nationalist standardization practices that sought to solidify their borders against a new and powerful neighbor. The development of the Himalayas as a subject of anthropological inquiry largely coincides with such developments in geopolitics and state standardization practices. James Fisher argues that the making of Himalayan studies coincides with the Chinese invasion and closure of Tibet to foreign research. Himalayan studies was also created out of border making in India and Nepal. As India, Nepal, and Bhutan consolidated their boundaries in response to China, state practices in ethnic classification began creating new confusions over ethnic identity and fueled ethnic tensions over access to state-given rights. As historic ethnically Tibetan communities continued their ways of life on either side of various borders alongside their Tibetan refugee counterparts, other communities, such as Dolpowas in Nepal, for instance, became mistaken often by foreigners and Nepali officials alike as Tibetan refugees, and as a result, not eligible for rights nor claim over their land. In India, the state began initiating integration projects for ethnic groups such as the Mimpas under the classification of scheduled tribe in order to incorporate such communities under the Indian government. These incidents caused such scholars of the Himalayas in Tibet to begin questioning categories of Tibetanness. Tsering Shakya suggested the framework of Tsamba as a way to recognize the shared and ongoing socio-cultural and historical worlds among Tibetan speakers, while also acknowledging the plurality of identity of the people that inhabit Tibetan and Himalayan regions under different national borders. For Sarah Schneiderman, however, the question of ethnicity within the nationalist framework was important. She argues that Tibetan as an ethnic category and Tibetan as a national category must be analytically separated and carefully defined according to the specifics of each empirical situation. Schneiderman's own research on the Tangmi demonstrate this by outlining Tangmi's struggles on the grounds for ethnic recognition by the Indian, Chinese, and Nepalese states as border-crossing, culturally Tibetan Himalayan people. Schneiderman's demarcation of ethnic versus nationalist Tibetanness reflects trends in the study of Himalayan nationalism and ethnicity since the late 20th century. After China closed Tibet to outsiders following its military invasion, state policies in the lead up to and during the Cultural Revolution brought tremendous death and destruction. The Cultural Revolution led to the end of many traditional systems and thereby inspired salvage methodologies among foreign and Tibetan researchers in their effort to preserve such systems outside of China. The death of Mao Zedong brought an end to the policies of the Cultural Revolution, and his successor, Deng Xiaoping, began implementing political reforms. China reopened Tibet to international tourism in the early 1980s. The Dalai Lama's diplomatic and spiritual travels to the West, which began in 1979 and culminated with him receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, increased journalistic coverage of Tibet. But even as awareness of the situation in Tibet grew internationally, within China, it deteriorated. Between 1987 and 1989, Tibetans in Lhasa began a series of political protests against Chinese rule. This led to eyewitness accounts by foreign tourists and thrust Tibet back into the international spotlight after 30 years of silence. As Tibet began experiencing increased media coverage in the international arena, scholars of Tibet also began considering ways in which Tibetan studies could break free from engaging Tibet as an object of the past and consider the types of changes resulting from Tibetan interactions with the modern era, both inside and outside Tibet. These concerns were fully engaged at the 1999 conference 40 years on, Tibet 1950 to 1990, at the University of London. In 1999, modern Tibetan studies became a formalized program at Columbia University. As such, much of the 1990s scholarship on Tibet became engrossed in critical debates concerning representational politics and the importance of history in the contemporary world. Melvin Goldstein's 1989 book, A History of Modern Tibet, 1913 to 1951, paved the way for these discussions. Due to its consideration of modern historical events, and also because the last book on Tibet's political history had been by Shakapa 23 years before. However, his work was quickly critiqued on issues of generalization and Eurocentrism, the tendency to exaggerate the political authority of central Tibet to wider Tibet, and unquestioned acceptance of Chinese points of view regarding diplomatic events. In 1999, Tsering Shakya published The Dragon in the Land of Snows. This book became seminal in setting the political record straight from the Tibetan point of view. While such works engaging Tibet's modern political history became enmeshed in scholarly debates, they also engaged with recent developments in Tibetan political history involving the Chinese invasion of Tibet in greater details from both sides in a manner not seen in previous decades. In 1998, Donald Lopez published Prisoners of Shangri-La, the second major work to consider the imperial legacies that had shaped the study of Tibet. Concerned with how the West constructed Tibet through popular and scholarly representations using the critique of Orientalism, Lopez concludes that such representational frameworks imprison Tibetans in both Western and Tibetan imagination as nothing more than tropes. According to Lopez, Tibet's complexities and competing histories have been flattened into a stereotype. Stereotypes operate through adjectives, which establish chosen characteristics as if they were eternal truths. Tibet is isolated. Tibetans are content. Monks are spiritual. With sufficient repetition, these adjectives become innate qualities, immune from history. And once these qualities harden into an essence, that essence may split into two opposing elements, end quote. Not only did such tropes ring untrue of lived Tibetan realities, but also ended up sidelining political issues such as the movement for independence Tibetans considered important. Although scholars of Tibet agreed with Lopez that Tibetan studies as a discourse was attached to Orientalist legacies, others were not convinced of his conclusion. Critical responses included a powerful argument from Tsering Shakya, who wrote, "The Western image of Tibet is essentially addressed to the home audience, and this gaze has never achieved the power of fixity within the indigenous society. The Tibetan attitude to developments in Western representations about Tibet remain at best bewilderment and at worst amounts to total ignorance." Others also critiqued Lopez for stripping Tibetans of agency in such representations, pointing out how Tibetans have themselves negotiated and contested such forms of representations in the past and continue to do so in the present. Such observations by Lopez and his critics highlight how Tibetans were not only aware, but also vocal and agentive in navigating such orientalizing frameworks. Yet their observations are taken seriously only when the ones making such observations are non-native scholars. Highlighting my earlier point about Tibetan studies' inability to view their native counterparts as producers of scholarship rather than data alone. These debates pushed Tibetan studies to recognize the field's colonial and Orientalist origins without ruling out Tibetan agency, and also questioned fundamental categories in the study of Tibet. For instance, much of the scholarship from Tibetan studies had barely questioned the homogeneous assumption that Tibetans were a generalizable ethnic category without subaltern subjectivities. This critical engagement of Tibetan studies, which began in the 1990s with the birth of modern Tibetan studies, would become seminal for directing the field in more dynamic directions in the decades that followed. The 2000s would become influential for producing scholarship that focused on contemporary Tibetan communities and questioned assumptions about ethnicity. Tibetan studies scholarship at the time reflected broader events, with a focus on research on the impact of globalization and migration on Tibetan exile communities in India and Nepal as refugees. Scholarship in Tibet and the Himalayas focused on state-mandated modernization efforts through development policies and how they manifested for Tibetans on the grounds as ethnic minorities. By the early 21st century, Tibetan refugees had redeveloped their worlds through nationalist politics and exile in Nepal and India, and increasingly the US. After China's invasion, the 14th Dalai Lama and his administration reestablished the Tibetan government in exile as a wide-scale salvage initiative that focused on preserving Tibetan culture to provide continuity and organize the exile community. Tibetan refugees also reconstituted Tibetan social and cultural worlds through the development of institutions and construction of settlements in Nepal and India. Such institutions and spaces reinforced Tibetan cultural notions of self, kinship, belonging, and authority with politicized, racialized, and gendered outcomes as a community negotiating exile. Tibetan refugees also met the challenges of economic sustainability, despite their lack of political status in Nepal and India through foreign aid and the development of their own entrepreneurial industries. Such works engage Tibetans as subjects of the present and show them interacting with modernity and globalization in diverse ways and settings, and with differing impacts on their subjectivity. While Tibetan ingenuity and agency in exile has been highlighted as avenues for the reconstitutions of themselves and their community, they have also stressed how their lack of political status in exile as refugees resulted in their marginalization at varying levels, which has led to outmigration in search of political citizenship in the West. Inside Tibet, scholarship became concerned with how China's Go West campaign impacted Tibetans as an ethnic minority through the discourse of modern development. The campaign intensified development in infrastructure and policy under China's modernization banner in Tibet and Xinjiang. By the 2000s, Tibet was reopened for not only international tourism, but also Chinese migrant workers and domestic tourism. The reopening also allowed foreign tourist-turned scholars to re-engage research on Tibet that had halted since 1959. Much of the scholarship looked at how the state narrated such developments in policy as necessary steps the state took to integrate and modernize Tibetans into larger China. Emily Ye, for instance, looked at how the state framed such modern development projects in Lhasa as gifts bestowed on the supposedly backward Tibetans in efforts to bring them into the modern world. The narrative of Tibetan backwardness also became the basis for state policies that targeted Tibetan nomads, first by seizing land they traditionally grazed under the government, and second, by transforming them into sedentary wage laborers with varying and marginalizing impacts. These policies also increased the flow of Tibetan migrants from rural to urban enclaves, where they are challenged with having become minorities in Chinese majority cities within Tibet. However, Tibetans meet such challenges in similar ways to Tibetans in exile, with pan-Tibetan identification and cultural preservation projects. Aware of the disproportionate marginalization they have experienced as a result of such state-mandated policies, Tibetans have responded in two ways: through the activation of their Chinese citizenship as ethnic minorities to generate counter-development, and through Tibetan nationalist rebellions by rejecting these policies altogether and challenging the state's authority in Tibet by recalling indigenous histories of self-rule. In recent times, such critiques have manifested as nationalist protests across the Tibetan plateau in 2008 that were followed by self-immolations, producing counter-narratives against the state in the process. State intervention has also become the focus of scholarly work elsewhere in borderland regions of the Himalayas. The PRC's increased military consolidation of its borders has forced nations like Nepal, Bhutan, India, and Myanmar to respond with their own consolidation protocols. Prior to Tibet's invasion, Himalayan kingdoms like Mustang, for instance, had enjoyed a dynamic society due to the region having served as a historic trading post for goods, ideas, kinship, and spiritual teachings traversing between larger Tibet, the Himalayas, and India. However, Tibet's invasion became the catalyst for the closure of such porous, fluid boundaries and led to the decline of such kingdoms and their transformation into neglected peripheral regions under Nepal's increasingly centralized state in Kathmandu. This has led to large-scale outmigration and depopulation of the region. However, by the early 2000s, increased Chinese-sponsored development in Nepal and encroachments on the Chinese side of the border saw such peripheral regions become renewed as examples of trans-regional manifestations of the Chinese gift of development and new forms of diplomacy. For instance, the Chinese government collaborated with the Nepalese government to build roads into Mustang with the intention of reestablishing Mustang as a trade hub. These developments initiated between Beijing and Kathmandu often marginalized local people who were directly impacted by such road-making activities where they are made irrelevant to decision-making. But the transnational turn in Tibetan and Himalayan studies has opened up new perspectives on these events. Anthropologist Sienna Craig's book on connections between Mustang, Nepalese, and Tibetan communities in New York City demonstrate new and old configurations of relatedness and how such reconfigurations complicate recently imposed geopolitical and state standardized racialized identities of the modern state. While such developments in scholarship have become important avenues for bridging the scholarship on traditional Tibetan societies with contemporary Tibetan worlds, sovereignty as a central theme is a generative framework through which to explore contemporary Tibetan identities alongside continued analytics of refugee ethnicity and modernity. Post-structuralist thinkers of modern power, such as Michel Foucault, have been insightful for articulating how Tibetan subjects navigate the modern world. Indigenous sovereignty became an important framework for thinkers such as Frantz Fanon, who helped shape the making of critical race and indigenous studies during the African era of decolonization for articulating indigenous responses and refusals to such dehumanizing mechanics of racializing colonial dominance with indigenous informed pathways towards anti-colonial futures. By focusing on Tibetan approaches to and frameworks of sovereignty, scholars not only engage Tibetans as subjects whose subjectivities are enacted upon by outside forces, but also as subjects capable of enacting their own destinies. Such an engagement of Tibetans also highlights what a structurally decolonizing practice could look like for scholars of Tibet. Analytical considerations of Tibetans through the framework of ethnicity has been productive. However, developing conversations on reforming the PRC's ethnic policy, which open call for new measures strengthening national integration at the expense of minority rights and autonomy in response to nationalist protests in Tibet and Xinjiang, suggests a need for scholars to decolonize the treatment of ethnicity by the state as a static category. Instead, the racialized classifications of Tibetans as an ethnic category should be analyzed from its inception under the emerging state of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, and how the category experiences constant modifications from the state that is engaged in redesigning its policies that centralize control of the national frontier. Treating invasion as a structure rather than an event shifts static portrayals of Tibetans as always struggling against conditions of exile as refugees, or struggling against modernization development projects as ethnic minorities. Instead, it acknowledges how Tibetans have been made refugees and ethnic minorities under the new modernist nationalist state of Nepal, India, and China, following the PRC's state's successful military invasion and consolidation of power in Tibet. Similarly, rethinking the category of Tibetan nationalism through the framework of sovereignty is generative in light of geopolitical developments. In the Himalayas, China's Belt Road Initiative has generated renewed interest in engaging past histories of the Tibetan government at the borders in new ways. The BRI, according to the PRC, is an effort to reestablish the old Silk Road of China's imperial past. It is a product of the current administration's attempt at reimagining its past by linking itself to monarchical legacies of China's dynastic history and their geographic conquests. Understanding this history allows for recognition of forms of state continuity that contrast with the foundational myth of the PRC as a new republic founded on the basis of the destruction of the old historical empires. Disputes over boundary making in the Himalayas force all sides involved to confront and engage the histories of border between the Tibetan government and its former neighbors of the Himalayan kingdoms. As a result, these events not only illuminate the living histories of Tibet's sovereignty, but also acknowledges the histories of former kingdoms of the Himalayas at the current geopolitical intersections of India, China, Bhutan, and Myanmar. Tibetan nationalism is represented as a recent construction by the Tibetan refugee elite in exile. However, the 2008 protests and the self-immolations by Tibetans, which emphasized Tibet's sovereign histories and call for the return of the 14th Dalai Lama as the rightful sovereign of the Tibetan people, have complicated such simplistic framings. Historical scholarship in Tibetan studies that focuses on the Tibetan Empire and works on the 18th and 19th century Tibet never denies Tibet's sovereign histories. Tibetan identity cannot be characterized based solely on ethnic or religious terms alone, as Tibetans have had a political identity that dates back to at least the 13th century and is the reason for why they have stepped into nationalist modernity with ease. It is the inclusive aspect of Tibetan refugee identity that allows outsiders to become incorporated within native categories that permits the process of Tibetanization to continue. Additionally, sovereignty also offers a nuanced approach for conceptualizing Tibetan nationalism in exile as a continuation of pre-1959 forms of governance rather than a new invention. Until his resignation in 2011, the 14th Dalai Lama continued to lead his people in India through the reestablishment of the Lhasa administration, and especially his lineage seat, the Ganden Potang, as the central Tibetan administration in India. Analytical considerations of hybridity, which views cultures as non-static continuities in conversation with the old and new, are useful for engaging the exile administration's development of democratic practices and protocols through the establishment of institutional bodies in order to represent Tibetans from all backgrounds and adapt to conditions of exile. This way of framing Tibetan nationalism allows for the recognition of the Dalai Lama's leadership in exile as exemplary of the continuation of his role in pre-invasion Tibet as a sovereign authority. A conceptualization of contemporary Tibetan nationalism as representative of the continuation of conceptualization of contemporary Tibetan nationalism as representative of the continuation of indigenous sovereignty also allows room for acknowledgement of the continued interactions between border communities of ethnic Tibetan ancestry and the CTA and its institutions. This acknowledgement prioritizes Tibetan cosmological and historical alignments rather than focusing on current modern national orders alone. This way of theorizing Tibetan sovereignty also permits Tibetan studies conversations concerning the process of Tibetanization to continue. This recognition not only impacts developing scholarship on Tibetans in China colonized Tibet and in exile, but also allows for the peoples and polities of the Himalayas to center their own histories based on sovereign pasts in connection with Tibet. As scholars of indigenous history in Australia, Patrick Wolf wrote, colonialism is a structure, not an event. Critically studying Tibet through the prism of sovereignty that considers imperial and colonial framings remains vital in the 21st century. European colonialism relied heavily on technologies of racialization to capture and extract the lands, bodies, and labors of others. In the current world, globalization and contemporary colonialism rely on algorithmic technologies that will embolden tomorrow's technologies of racialization, warrants Ashil Membe. Scholars investigating the development of such technologies in China have noted how the peripheral territories of Tibet and Xinjiang and their colonized subjects have functioned as primary testing sites for these new modes of racializing state surveillance. Moving from the laboratory of the settler state, these technologies are then reproduced in Han-majority urban metropoles and subsequently repackaged to be sold in the international market. It is also at such intersections of state power in the colonies that Tibetan sovereignty is articulated through indignant refusals against the colonizing sovereign powers of the state. These refusals inspire new generations of Tibetans worldwide to sustain the anti-occupation nationalist movement that their predecessors began following China's invasion of Tibet. As such, sovereignty is a necessary framework Sovereignty is a necessary framework, not only for analyzing modern state powers, which seek to consume and discredit Tibetan worlds, but for recognizing how Tibetan refusals of these powers have developed historically, and how these refusals continue for Tibetans and other indigenous communities around the world. Such an engagement would also offer Tibetan studies an avenue to shift away from its orientalizing legacies towards analysis of Tibetans that broaden rather than narrow their worlds. Thank you.